So we were able to switch this jar out to treated material. So we just wanted to do a quick comparison and we'll get this going again.
I've got to ask, how many iterations of this machine did you go through? Did you have a couple that were not working real well?
Actually is the original.
It is.
But it ate a lot of motors. And so I kind of figured out the right balance of slop here and there. But there are other machines that I did build and they are at the other labs.
Now is this one just a...
It's able to produce this test in triplicate.
Okay.
It's heavier duty motor, heavier duty everything, because there's so much weight moving around. So this one, like Frank was saying, we want to try to speed up the test. I mean, 50,000 shakes keeps this thing running all day. You know, come in at 8 o'clock and just get one data point in one day is not as efficient. So being able to run it in triplicate is really helpful.
So yeah, I think when we were shaking, we were probably shaking quicker or faster or more rapidly than this is shaking when we were just doing it this way. Okay.
So we stopped the untreated, I think, at about 175, so we'll stop this one in 2 shakes here.
And a typical result, we'll see an untreated wet out anywhere from 100 to 1,500 shakes.
Now, and the other thing I would say is that your performance claims, aren't dramatic performance claims because it's, a minute difference in performance makes a difference between that product, that down insulation failing versus still performing well and insulating, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Right here you can absolutely tell that the untreated down was partially submerged in the water, and there is almost nothing or none of the treated down in the water at this point. And so
yeah,
I'm going to try and hold up,
and you can
so
see
I'm holding the
loft
camera at
all
the
of
same
it,
time. So you actually see the loft difference between the two, and they're stopped approximately at the same amount of shakes, where this is the untreated down, this is the treated down right here. Sorry about the focus on that.
You're so brilliant, Frank. That's why I keep my mouth shut.
We got all that on camera too. He said it.
All those variables that your high school science teacher was telling you, were important to keep track of when you're doing an experiment. It's really true. We were really pretty surprised to see how sensitive the test is to the amount of water that you put in there, the jar size, the nature of the motion, specifically how it goes from one direction to the other. Is that a smooth transition or is it an abrupt transition? And it all matters. Now, and as long as you fix those variables and use the same conditions, you get good data. If you go at it and don't pay attention to those things, you'll end up with a bunch of stuff and it really won't mean anything.
You'll end up with the ProLite Gear video. We'll edit that out.
And again,
got you guys down here.
And again, kudos to you guys for going ahead and asking the questions and trying and poking at it. But looking at it, when Matt and I were looking at it, it was bringing back memories of where we were 2 years ago, and asking the same questions, and then figuring, all right, we need to control that, we need to control that, we need to control that, and then you start seeing the benefit. Now, it's about controlling those variables. It's not about adjusting the variables to see the benefit. It's about controlling the variables so that you get good, consistent results time after time. So if we want to move on to the next method, the Loft shake method, these samples are actually a really good, serve as a really good example of what we do in that method. Fundamentally, what we're trying to measure in the Loft shake method is how much loft is retained when the down is exposed to water. We did a lot of tests very similar to the one that you guys did with steam.
Okay.
And one thing about the steam is that, you know, the temperature is obviously very close to boiling.
Right.
And that's not necessarily a mimic of either environmental water or even of body moisture. And you pointed out in your video, one of the other components that's necessary to see down fail is compression.
Right.
Some type of force pushing it down. They actually use steam to condition down when they're processing it to restore the loft in the down. So you were pointing out that let's add some compression. The way we approached it was to put the down into the jar with water, have a set number of shakes to expose the down to the water in a reproducible fashion at ambient temperature, and then measure the impact of the loft. So versus going to, you know, an endpoint where we've completely saturated the down and saying, well, is there a difference now? Well, no, there's not. They both fail.
And that's where Brad and I felt our test was not valid, because we took it right to a failure point and took it to that failure point within a matter of minutes, which isn't a real world scenario.
Right. I mean, you won't go from good 100% loft to that condition like that.
Right. And you'll have, especially in the case of a sleeping bag, you're going to have compression as you roll around.
As you're moving.
Humidity levels will build gradually over time, so we went to 100% humidity immediately.
You know, you think of winter camping, a stuff sack in the morning, you're ready to get going, you take your bag. Ideally, if you have time to dry it out, you do that.
Right.
A lot of times that doesn't happen. Goes into a waterproof bag, sub-zero temperatures, the water's not going anywhere. Your down or whatever you have in that bag better be able to handle the moisture.
Right.
So in the loft shake method, what we do is, again, known amount of down, known amount of water, certain number of shakes in a prescribed way, and then we literally measure the loft retained inside the jars. So if we had set the samples up for that measurement, we would have put a piece of tape on there, and then from the water line up, measure how much loft is retained. Now this is a sample that's been...
I was sitting in the jar since last night, so that's why it's not
Oh, okay.
looking good.
So if we had this tape on this one, you know, the untreated, there's some loft.
Mm-hmm.
You know, things are probably getting pretty miserable at this point.
Yeah, your nylon is soaked out at that point, I'm
Exactly.
sure.
So, but Frank, I'm lost or confused because I don't understand how that is simulating compression on the down.
The action of the water. The fact that we're not passively introducing moisture vapor through the down, we're hitting it with the bulk water.
And it's the compression or the agitation that's breaking that surface tension bond on the down plumes.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's letting them wet against each other.
Okay, so a standing water test isn't valid in our opinion. Do you agree with that?
Standing water doesn't introduce the compressive force.
Right, okay.
And
So
then,
that's why you
And then
measured
the
it.
compressive force, is that valid? Absolutely it's valid.
Right.
It's totally real world.
Now, do you think that it's more valid in a sleeping bag scenario versus a jacket scenario? Because sleeping bags tend to get compressed more than a jacket does as you're sleeping on them and moving around.
Quite honestly, I think the time frames are different in that the sleeping bag, you know, it's a 6-hour, 8-hour, 10-hour, 12-hour kind of exposure time.
Right.
And a different kind of motion. But I think it's still very much relevant in the context of apparel. If you're out moving and you're sitting on a chairlift or you're kneeling down to do something, you're wearing a pack, there's plenty of compressive forces. In particular, when you're wearing a pack, that also becomes the least breathable.
Is the water that we're trying to prevent from wetting out the down, is that, from your experience, more from the environment or more from the body putting out water as just a natural process of what the body does?
One is avoidable through, you know, good management of your apparel system.
Right.
the external stuff.
Right.
You know, unless there's a failure or an accident or you fall off a log or whatever.
That's a really good point.
I mean, that's avoidable if you're, you know, doing the layering system and using your gear appropriately. The other one is unavoidable, the insensible perspiration.
Right.
And it's an insensible, not the you get into your sleeping bag and you're just too warm and you know it.
Okay.
No, you're in your sleeping bag and everything's fine, but your body is still putting off moisture.
And can you tell us how much on average of the human body puts out?
So the numbers are obviously dependent on the body size and your metabolic rate and that sort of thing, but over the course of an 8-hour period, you can put out as much as a liter of water.
And Brad would be at least 3 times that.
Oh, hands down.
You know, and you think about a winter camping situation, the outer shell of your sleeping bag can very realistically be at you know, the freezing point.
Okay.
That moisture is going to have a really hard time leaving.
How big of a role does relative humidity play?
Oh, it's huge.
Okay.
It's huge. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, and we've translated a lot of these tests into real-world performance, where we've taken sleeping bags out and had other people take sleeping bags out and measured relative humidity and measured temperature and measured loft. And, you know, to a data point, the technology has always been effective. It's always demonstrated an effect. The magnitude of the effect is going to be dependent on all of those environmental conditions that change from trip to trip, day to day, person to person.
So in terms of testing this, there's just so many variables involved that it's pretty difficult to come up with a real-world scenario that's going to represent all those data variables perfectly, because it's going to vary from like Pacific Northwest down to maybe a high arid desert.
Exactly.
Okay.
And
exactly. You know, it's really important to, you know, we think, make those sorts of claims based on reproducible methods that we can hand a sample to you, we can hand a sample to a third-party lab, which is what we've done for every number that you see sort of on our website, see in any ads. It's come from a third-party lab, not from here.
Sure. There's some legalities around that as well, right? If you're going to state a performance claim against another competing product, by law, I think you're required to publish the test methodology. Is that correct?
That's probably correct. I'm gonna say, you know, from a good science standpoint, that's just how you do it.
Just how you do it. Okay.
I mean,
have you tested the down at all? Like, we're using distilled water right here.
Yep.
Have you tested it in the presence of a little bit of salt, like stuff that like people sweat, like a little bit of fatty acid, a little bit of stuff like that in the combination with the distilled water, or is it strictly a distilled water test at this point?
Not in the lab.
Not in the lab. Okay.
Not in the lab. In the field testing, obviously. Yes.
Is that a harder metric to grab from field testing? Just saying, yeah, it's more of a perception than an actual number.
No, I mean, we could, most definitely. It would simply be a matter of controlling those variables. What is the salt concentration going to be?
Yeah.
You know, what is the fatty acid going to be? We've looked at it, and again, there's pretty different conditions from person to person. So we thought the simpler, fairer test was really to go with distilled water.
Okay, that's fair.
Actually, the Loft shake test is really a matter of exposing the down in these jars to a certain number of shakes with the water, and then measuring how much loft is there in the down that's above.
How many shakes do you usually do in between each measuring?
For the Loft shake, it's 5, 10, and then 15.
Okay.
So that's actually a nice short test to run.
Now, because there's not a, you know, because as you look at the sample, there's not a very super clear, distinct top line, we actually run 5 trials per experiment, per sample, and then average that to get a number. Because if I took this one if there's one kind of, you know, rogue feather that's doing something unusual, I could get bad data.
And all these are done with half a gram of down, is that correct?
Loft shake is 1 gram, wet out is half, and the dry out is 2.
Okay.
Frank, a question I have. Have you noticed any significant performance difference between using a higher fill power down, like an 800 or 900 fill power down, versus a lower fill power down, like a 600 or 700 fill power down?
We see a greater sensitivity to the fill power for, quite honestly, less effective treatments. If you have a good treatment, and that's a combination of having the right kind of material going onto your down, and then a good processing of it so that it adheres very well, you actually can get very good performance from lower fill power down with respect to the hydrophobic nature. Mm-hmm. Now, if you go to some of the less performing technologies, you'll see big differences between a 600 and an 800 fill power in terms of the hydrophobic nature.
Okay.